He tossed her aside for someone younger, never expecting to see her again. But years later she returns, stronger, more powerful, and carrying a twist that will make him regret everything. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate shimmered under the glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, casting a dazzling golden hue over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and murmurs of conversation floated through the air as socialites clinked glasses of the finest champagne, exchanging pleasantries with one another. It was the engagement party of the year, no, the decade, an event so exclusive that even the most powerful families in the city had scrambled for an invitation. Amidst the grandeur, Eleanor Sinclair stood at the heart of it all, her delicate hands resting over the small swell of her stomach. Dressed in a flowing silver gown that accentuated her pregnancy, she should have been the picture of joy, but instead her heart pounded in dread, her throat dry despite the untouched glass of sparkling water in her hand. She had sensed something was wrong the moment she walked in, the way the conversations hushed as she passed, how some of the guests averted their eyes while others whispered behind their champagne flutes. There was a chill in the air, one that had nothing to do with the luxurious air conditioning. Then came the moment that shattered everything. At the far end of the ballroom, her husband, no, the man she had called her husband, stood under a golden arch, his arm draped around another woman. Not just any woman, Isabella Moreau. Tall, stunning, and unapologetically seductive, Isabella was everything the tabloids adored. Her crimson dress clung to every curve, and her glossy raven hair cascaded down her back in perfect waves. She smirked, as if reveling in Eleanor's impending devastation. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw the banner hanging behind them. Congratulations to Victor and Isabella on their engagement. Her entire body turned to ice. This wasn't happening. Not here, not now. Not when she carried his child. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Eleanor took a staggering step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor? Victor Blackwood turned toward her, his expression a mask of irritation rather than guilt. He was as impeccably dressed as ever in a tailored black suit, his dark hair neatly combed back, his posture oozing confidence. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, now looked at her as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. "Ah, Eleanor," he said smoothly, taking a sip from his glass as if he were greeting a mere acquaintance. "I was hoping you'd get the hint and stay home." The words sliced through her like a dagger. Stay home? He had deliberately invited her here, to this spectacle, to humiliate her. Her stomach twisted violently, nausea surging through her. What is this?" she asked, her voice quivering despite her best efforts. Victor sighed, rubbing his temples as though she were a tiresome obligation. "Let's not make a scene, Eleanor. You knew this was inevitable. Our marriage was a mistake. You were a mistake." A cruel chuckle slipped past Isabella's lips, her manicured fingers grazing Victor's arm possessively. "Darling, don't be so harsh," she purred, her emerald eyes glinting with amusement. "She looks so fragile." Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She forced herself to stand tall, to cling to whatever dignity she had left. "Victor," she said, voice firm despite the devastation crashing inside her, "I am carrying your child." A hush fell over the crowd. Victor's expression didn't soften. If anything, he looked bored. "And? That doesn't change anything. We're done, Eleanor." Someone in the audience let out a shocked gasp. The weight of his words was suffocating. You're leaving me? Publicly like this?" she whispered, horror lacing her voice. Victor exhaled impatiently. "I'm divorcing you. I've already filed the papers. You'll receive them soon enough. There's no point in dragging this out." Tears burned behind Eleanor's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of these people. Not in front of him. "And our baby?" she asked, her voice a mere thread of sound. Victor's gaze flickered to her stomach briefly before returning to his glass, completely indifferent. "That's your problem now." Her heart shattered. Isabella let out a low laugh. "Poor thing, maybe you should have been more exciting in bed, darling. Then he wouldn't have gotten bored so fast." A fresh wave of humiliation surged through Eleanor, but she bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Number. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned on her heel and walked away, her hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with the effort to hold herself together. Victor's voice called after her, his tone light, almost mocking. "Oh, and Eleanor? I'd appreciate it if you didn't use my last name anymore. You don't deserve it." Laughter rippled through the guests, the final stab to her already bleeding heart. Tears blurred her vision as she made her way to the exit, the golden chandeliers above casting a cruel light on the moment she lost everything. And yet, as she stepped into the cold night air, something inside her shifted. She might have lost her husband, she might have lost her name, but she would never let them take away her dignity. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, around the child who had no idea of the storm raging in the world they were about to be born into. "I will rise from this," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. No matter what it took, she would rise. Eleanor's feet carried her through the cold streets, the echoes of laughter and whispered gossip still ringing in her ears. The neon lights of the city blurred into a dizzying haze, each step heavier than the last. She wasn't sure how long she walked, minutes, hours, but when she finally stopped, she found herself in front of an old building, its dimly lit sign flickering in and out of focus. A small cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods wafted through the air, mingling with the comforting warmth that contrasted with the chill in her bones. She pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly as she stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, save for a barista behind the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner. The world had moved on, oblivious to the life-altering disasters she had just endured. With shaky hands, she ordered a cup of tea and took a seat by the window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, her once pristine makeup smudged, her silver gown wrinkled, her expression hollow. Her fingers instinctively moved to her stomach where her unborn child rested. How had her life fallen apart so completely in a single night? A few months ago, she was Eleanor Blackwood, wife of one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, the woman who had once walked red carpets beside him, attended charity galas, been envied by all. Now she was no one. No home, no husband, no security, just a baby growing inside her and a shattered heart. Her tea arrived, and she wrapped her hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into her freezing fingers. She knew she should be crying, should be breaking down, but the tears wouldn't come, because beneath the devastation, something else simmered. Something dark, anger, not just at Victor, not just at Isabella, at herself. How had she been so blind, so naive? She had trusted Victor, believed his lies, convinced herself that love would be enough. She had built her world around him, made herself smaller so that he could shine brighter. And in return, he had discarded her like she was nothing. Numbers, she wasn't nothing. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood. She had spent years being the perfect wife, the elegant socialite, the doting partner. And for what? To be humiliated in front of an entire city? To be replaced like a worn-out accessory? Never again. She wasn't going to disappear. She wasn't going to fade into the background, becoming just another tragic cautionary tale whispered among the elite. She was going to rebuild. She didn't know how, she didn't know where to start, but she would. Because if there was one thing she was sure of, it was this. One day, Victor Blackwood would regret this night, and when that day came, she would no longer be the woman he had tossed aside. She would be someone else entirely. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of an unfamiliar apartment door, exhaustion pulling at every inch of her body. She knocked twice. A few moments later, the door swung open, revealing a woman in an oversized sweatshirt and sweatpants, her dark curls piled into a messy bun. "Eleanor?" Eleanor's lips parted slightly, relief washing over her for the first time since the disaster of the previous night. Vivian Carter, her best friend, the one person in the world who had never cared about her wealth, her status, or the social circles she had been forced to navigate. Without another word, Vivian pulled her inside and shut the door. "Sit," she ordered, already heading toward the kitchen, "and tell me why you look like a ghost." Eleanor sank onto the couch, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on her. The smell of coffee filled the air as Vivian returned with 2 mugs, placing one in Eleanor's hands. And then, finally, the dam broke. She told Vivian everything. The party, the betrayal, the way Victor had humiliated her in front of everyone, the divorce papers, the cold, heartless way he had dismissed their baby. By the time she was finished, her voice was hoarse, her hands trembling around the coffee cup. Vivian, usually the composed one, was livid. "That absolute bastard," she seethed, pacing the small living room. "Are you kidding me? He cheated on you, publicly humiliated you, and then just threw you away?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I should have seen it coming." Vivian stopped pacing. Number, this isn't your fault, Elle. That man is a snake. And that, she waved her hand dramatically, Isabella is just another one of his pathetic toys. I swear, I'd strangle him myself if I had the chance. Eleanor exhaled a shaky breath. I don't know what to do, Viv. I have nothing left. Vivian's expression softened and she sat down beside her, taking her hands. You have me, and you have that baby. That's more than enough to start over. Eleanor blinked back tears. Start over? How? Vivian leaned back, crossing her arms. That's the question, isn't it? A pause, and then suddenly Vivian smirked. I think it's time the world meets the real Eleanor Sinclair. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? Vivian tapped her fingers against her chin. You spent years in Victor's shadow, Elle. You know the ins and outs of high society, business, wealth. You were never just his wife. You were his partner. You know how these people think, how they operate, and now you have nothing to lose. Eleanor hesitated. Are you saying I should, what? Become a socialite again? Try to get back into those circles? Vivian grinned. I'm saying you should burn those circles to the ground. Eleanor stared at her, something electric stirring in her chest. You want revenge? Vivian continued, leaning in. Then stop playing by their rules. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. For the first time since last night, she felt something other than pain. She felt purpose. Vivian wasn't wrong. She did know how these people operated. She had lived in their world for years, and now she had nothing holding her back. Victor had stripped everything away from her, but he had also set her free. And freedom was the most dangerous thing a woman like her could have. She met Vivian's gaze, a slow smile forming. Let's do it. Eleanor spent the next few weeks adjusting to a life she hadn't known in years. Gone were the luxury penthouses, the designer wardrobes, the high society luncheons where the rich gossiped over champagne. Instead, she found herself waking up in Vivian's modest apartment, borrowing clothes that weren't custom-tailored to her body, and learning to navigate a world where every dollar counted. And yet, despite it all, she didn't feel weak. She felt alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by Victor Blackwood's name. She was Eleanor Sinclair, and Eleanor Sinclair was ready to rise. One morning, as she sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone, she saw exactly what she had expected. Victor and Isabella's engagement announcement. The news was everywhere. Victor Blackwood and Isabella Hart, power couple of the year. Blackwood Empire CEO set to marry stunning heiress. Billionaire's fiancé spotted in a lavish shopping spree. Eleanor's stomach clenched, but not in the way it had weeks ago. She no longer felt broken. Instead, she felt focused. He had discarded her. Now, she was going to redefine herself. Vivian entered the room, glancing at Eleanor's phone before rolling her eyes. Ugh, please, look at her. She grabbed the phone and scrolled through the article, showing Eleanor a photo of Isabella posing with a diamond ring the size of a golf ball. She looks like she's auditioning for a soap opera villain role. Eleanor smirked. Fitting, don't you think? Vivian sat across from her, setting the phone down. All right, babe. Enough sulking. It's time. What's our game plan? Eleanor leaned back, tapping her nails against the table. I need to build something of my own. Vivian tilted her head. Something big, something that will make you untouchable. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. I want my name to mean something. Not because I was Victor Blackwood's wife, but because I built something from the ground up. Vivian smirked. Oh, I love this energy. So what are we thinking? Fashion, philanthropy, tech startup? Eleanor sipped her coffee thoughtfully. I know Victor's world inside and out. I know the markets, the investors, the deals. I sat in on his meetings for years. Hell, I helped him secure half of his major partnerships. I just never got the credit. Vivian's eyes widened. Wait, are you saying you want to go into business? Eleanor's lips curled into a slow, confident smile. I don't just want to go into business, Viv. I want to dominate it. Starting over wasn't easy. With no access to her old bank accounts, Victor had frozen everything. Eleanor had to get creative. She had nothing to her name except for a single investment account Victor hadn't been able to touch. It wasn't much compared to her old wealth, but it was enough to start. She poured herself into researching the market, identifying gaps, looking for opportunities. She stayed up late, studied, strategized, and slowly, piece by piece, her vision started to form. A luxury consulting firm, one that specialized in brand elevation, crisis management, and public relations for the ultra-wealthy. Because if there was one thing Eleanor had learned from her time as Victor's wife, it was that reputation was everything. She had seen powerful men crumble under scandals. She had seen fortunes vanish because of a single PR disaster. And she knew exactly how to control a narrative. She just needed funding. Vivian leaned against the counter, watching Eleanor scribble notes across a whiteboard. All right, so let me get this straight. You want to help the ultra-rich fix their image? Eleanor smirked. More like control it, guide it, craft it. These people live off perception, Viv. They'll pay millions to protect their brand. Vivian whistled. I gotta say, babe, this is brilliant. Eleanor set her marker down. I just need an investor. Vivian grinned. Lucky for you, I know a guy. Eleanor blinked. You what? Vivian leaned in, her eyes twinkling. You remember Lucas Reed? Eleanor's stomach flipped. Lucas Reed as in the Lucas Reed? CEO of Reed Global? Vivian nodded. He owes me a favor, and he's been looking for fresh investment opportunities. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Lucas Reed was a giant in the business world. He had built an empire from nothing, and his name alone carried weight. If she could get him to back her, her comeback wouldn't just be successful, it would be legendary. A few days later, Eleanor found herself in one of the most exclusive private lounges in the city. Lucas Reed sat across from her, his sharp blue eyes scanning the proposal she had spent weeks perfecting. He was an enigma, young for a billionaire, but with a reputation for being ruthless in business. He finally set the papers down and steepled his fingers. You've done your homework. Eleanor straightened. I have. You understand that this is a high-stakes industry? Lucas leaned forward. You'd be dealing with CEOs, politicians, high-profile clients, people who don't just want discretion, they demand it. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. And I know how to handle them. Lucas studied her for a long moment. Then a slow smirk curved his lips. Victor Blackwood has no idea what he's just created, does he? Eleanor's breath hitched slightly, but she kept her expression composed. Lucas continued. You were his secret weapon, the real mind behind half of his best deals, and now you're about to become his biggest competition. Eleanor's heart pounded. Lucas leaned back, amusement flickering in his gaze. You know what? I like it. Eleanor exhaled. You do? Lucas picked up his pen, signing the investment agreement with a flourish. Let's build an empire, Ms. Sinclair. The moment Eleanor stepped out of the lounge, her phone buzzed. Vivian. Well, Eleanor inhaled sharply, the reality sinking in. She had done it. She had secured the funding. She was no longer a discarded ex-wife. She was a CEO, a force to be reckoned with. She smiled. He signed. Vivian screamed on the other end of the phone. Yes! Eleanor Sinclair is officially back, baby. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened as she gazed out at the glittering city skyline. No, Viv, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. She's just getting started. Victor Blackwood had no idea his past was about to catch up with him. For the past 3 years, his life had been exactly as he wanted it. Lavish parties, a beautiful young fiancée, and an empire that seemed untouchable. Everything had fallen into place just the way he had envisioned the day he threw Eleanor out of his life. His reputation was solid. His wealth had multiplied. He was seen as an unstoppable force in the business world. And yet something was missing. At first, he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had Isabella, the woman he had left Eleanor for. He had everything money could buy. And yet, there were moments when he would wake up in the middle of the night and feel an unsettling emptiness. Maybe it was because Isabella had changed. She was no longer the exciting, mysterious woman who had captivated him all those years ago. At first, their relationship had been thrilling, filled with passion, secrecy, and the excitement of the forbidden. But now Isabella had become nothing more than a demanding socialite, obsessed with her image, spending his money as if it was endless, and constantly seeking validation from their high society friends. The more time passed, the more Victor realized how little he actually knew about her. She wasn't the woman he had imagined spending his life with. She was just a beautiful mask, covering nothing but selfishness and vanity. But it was too late now. He had made his choice, and yet deep down he was starting to wonder if he had made a mistake. One evening, as he sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city, a notification popped up on his phone. An article. At first he was about to ignore it, but then he saw the name. Eleanor Sinclair. His heart stopped for a moment. It had been years since he had seen that name in the headlines. Out of sheer curiosity, he clicked the article, expecting to see some pathetic story about her struggling to move on. Maybe she had remarried some middle-class businessman. Maybe she had disappeared into obscurity. But what he saw instead shook him to his core. Eleanor Sinclair, the woman who built an empire from the ashes of betrayal. His eyes darted across the words, scanning the article faster than he could process. Luxury brand consultant, one of the most sought-after names in the industry, landed multi-million-dollar contracts with the biggest elite names in business and entertainment. Funded by Lucas Reed, now a force to be reckoned with. Victor froze. Lucas Reed? One of the most powerful businessmen in the world? Had invested in Eleanor? His Eleanor? Victor clenched his jaw, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. How? How had she done this? He had left her with nothing. No money, no power, no connections. She was supposed to be broken, forgotten. And yet here she was, thriving. And worse, she had done it without him. Victor stared at her picture in the article, his chest tightening with something he didn't quite understand. It had been so long since he had seen her. She looked different. She wasn't the timid, soft-spoken wife he had once known. Her posture was strong, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, those same brilliant green eyes that had once looked at him with love, were now filled with an undeniable power. And suddenly Victor felt something he never thought he'd feel. Regret. For the first time, he questioned everything. Had he miscalculated? Had he let go of something, someone far more valuable than he had realized? He didn't have the answer. But one thing was certain, he needed to see her. Victor wasn't sure what he was expecting when he reached out. Maybe he thought she'd ignore him. Maybe he thought she'd send a bitter reply, something scathing and full of resentment. But instead, his assistant informed him that Eleanor had agreed to a meeting. And just like that, he found himself standing outside her office. A high-rise glass tower, one of the most exclusive business headquarters in the city. The fact that she even had an office like this was unsettling enough. But as he stepped inside, walking past impeccably dressed employees who greeted him with respect, not because he was Victor Blackwood, but because they worked for Eleanor Sinclair, he felt something unfamiliar, something he had never felt before in his life. Intimidation. She was powerful now, and this was her world. The receptionist led him to a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. And then he saw her, standing behind a sleek glass desk dressed in an elegant black power suit, arms crossed. The moment their eyes met, his breath hitched. He hadn't expected this. She was breathtaking. Not in the same way Isabella was. Isabella was a polished diamond, perfect but soulless. Eleanor, she was fire. And for the first time, Victor wasn't sure if he was standing in front of the woman he had once discarded, or someone far stronger. She sat down, her expression unreadable. Victor. Even the way she said his name had changed. No warmth, no longing, just control. Victor sat down across from her, feeling off balance in a way he never had before. You agreed to meet with me. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. I was curious. Victor exhaled, trying to steady himself. You've done well for yourself, she smirked. Yes, I have. Silence. Victor ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. He wasn't used to this, feeling like he was the one on the losing end. I saw the article, he admitted. I didn't expect for me to survive, she cut in smoothly. Victor swallowed hard. No, she leaned forward, her green eyes piercing. I don't owe you an explanation, Victor. He stiffened. I never said you did. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. But you want one, don't you? Victor clenched his jaw. Eleanor, you left me, she continued, voice calm. You humiliated me. You made sure I had nothing. And now, after all these years, you sit here, in my office, acting like any of this is your business. Victor's chest tightened. This wasn't the Eleanor he had known. This was someone else entirely. And for the first time since he left her, he realized the truth. Maybe, just maybe, he had lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. This concludes Section 4, 1,000+ words, diving into Victor's growing regret and the first meeting between him and Eleanor after years apart. Victor had always been the kind of man who controlled the room. His presence alone dictated the terms of every interaction, and he had never once doubted his authority. But sitting in Eleanor's office, in her space, her empire, he felt powerless. She exuded an aura of calm dominance, and the way she held herself, the way she commanded the conversation made it clear. She was no longer the woman he had left behind. She was more, and Victor didn't know how to handle it. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, to find some way to regain his footing in this conversation. But Eleanor didn't look like a woman who was waiting for an apology. She looked like a woman who had already moved on, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Victor cleared his throat. "I didn't come here to fight." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, the hint of a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "Did you come here to make amends then?" He hesitated, because the truth was he didn't know why he had come. Curiosity, guilt, regret, maybe all three. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I saw the article and I realized we hadn't spoken in years." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "So now that the world knows I'm successful, suddenly I'm worth talking to." Victor flinched. She wasn't wrong, but he wasn't about to admit that. I didn't expect you to be here," he admitted. "I didn't expect you to." "To what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Survive?" Victor swallowed hard. She was hitting every nerve, and the worst part, she knew it. "You're different," he muttered. Eleanor smiled, slow and deliberate. "Yes, I am." Victor's jaw tightened. "What happened to you?" Her green eyes darkened for just a moment before she gave him a small, knowing smile. "You did." Victor's breath caught. He did this. She had been his wife, his pregnant wife. He had left her when she needed him the most, humiliated her in front of the world, and then walked away as if she had meant nothing. And yet she had survived. No, she had thrived, and he should have been proud of her. Instead, he felt sick. Victor clenched his fists under the table. "I didn't mean for things to end the way they did." Eleanor laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Oh, you mean you didn't mean to humiliate me? To leave me pregnant and alone while you ran off with your mistress? That wasn't your intention?" Victor looked away. He had no excuse for what he had done. But that didn't change the fact that seeing her like this, powerful, confident, untouchable, was something he hadn't prepared for. And the worst part? She didn't need him anymore. He had spent the last 3 years with Isabella, but had he ever once looked at her the way he was looking at Eleanor now? Because Isabella wasn't Eleanor, and she never would be. Victor exhaled slowly. "You're right." Eleanor blinked, a flicker of surprise passing through her gaze. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I won't sit here and pretend I didn't make mistakes. I did. I made the worst mistake of my life." Silence. Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, but Victor couldn't stop now. "I thought I was chasing happiness," he admitted, his voice quieter. "I thought that by choosing someone else I was choosing freedom. But the truth is, Eleanor," he swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. "I was wrong." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time since he had walked into her office, he saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but something closer to understanding. And somehow that hurt even more, because it meant she had already made peace with the past, and that meant there was no going back. Victor clenched his jaw. "Did you ever?" He hesitated. "Did you ever think about reaching out?" Eleanor exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "No." His stomach twisted. Not once? Not even to tell him about the baby? Not even to hurt him the way he had hurt her? His throat felt tight. "Why?" Eleanor studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Because I promised myself that I'd never beg a man to love me again." Victor flinched. She didn't say it with anger. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it as if it was a fact. And somehow that made it worse. Victor inhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You have every right to hate me," he admitted. "I know that." Eleanor chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, Victor." She leaned forward, her piercing green eyes locking onto his. "I don't hate you." Victor's chest tightened. "She didn't?" Eleanor smiled, slow and deliberate. "I just don't care anymore." And that was the worst thing she could have said. Victor had expected anger. He had expected resentment, bitterness, maybe even fury. But indifference, that was unbearable. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, tilting her head slightly. Was there anything else, Victor? His jaw clenched, and he wanted to say something, to ask for something, to fix something. But what was there to fix? She had moved on, and he was the only one left in the past. Victor exhaled slowly, standing up. No, he said finally. That's all. Eleanor nodded once, her smile never faltering. Then I guess this is goodbye. He hesitated. She was offering him an exit, a clean break. But for some reason, he didn't want to take it. Instead, he looked at her one last time, memorizing every detail of the woman he had once called his wife. And then he walked away. Victor stepped out of Eleanor's office, his heart pounding. He had expected closure, but instead he had walked away feeling like he had lost something far more valuable than he had ever realized. And for the first time in his life, Victor Blackwood regretted everything, everything. Victor walked out of Eleanor's office, but his thoughts refused to leave with him. The moment he stepped onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, the city lights blurred into a chaotic haze. His mind replayed every second of their conversation, every word she had spoken with unwavering certainty. She didn't hate him, she just didn't care. That was worse than any slap, any screaming match, any dramatic outburst he could have anticipated. It was worse than revenge because it meant she had truly let him go, and he couldn't stand it. Victor had spent the last 3 years convincing himself that leaving Eleanor had been the right decision. He had told himself she wasn't what he wanted anymore, that Isabella was everything Eleanor wasn't. Passionate, spontaneous, unapologetic, but was that really true? His grip tightened around his phone as he slid into the back seat of his black SUV. "Where to, Mr. Blackwood?" the driver asked. Victor hesitated. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. Home? Number. The thought of stepping into that empty penthouse where Isabella used to lounge around spending his money made his stomach churn. Work? Number. He had barely been able to focus ever since he saw that article, the one that had led him to Eleanor in the first place. His jaw clenched. Why had he even gone to see her? What had he expected? That she would look at him with teary eyes, waiting for him to come back? That she had spent these years suffering, regretting everything just as he did? The realization that she hadn't, that she had built something stronger, something that no longer included him, was a pain he wasn't ready for. Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "The Blackwood estate," he muttered. The driver nodded, pulling into traffic. The ride home was silent, but Victor's thoughts screamed louder than ever. How had this happened? How had he let the best thing in his life slip away? His mind drifted back to that fateful night, the night he had ended his marriage. The Blackwood Gala had been one of the most extravagant events of the year. Eleanor had looked stunning in an emerald green gown, standing beside him like the perfect billionaire's wife. Every guest had turned to admire her, envying how effortlessly she carried herself. But behind the smiles, their marriage had already begun to crack. Isabella had already entered the picture. Victor had convinced himself that Eleanor was too controlled, too predictable, too proper. That Isabella, with her reckless charm and untamed spirit, was what he needed. And so, that night, in front of hundreds of people, he had humiliated Eleanor. He had wrapped an arm around Isabella in the middle of the ballroom, whispered something into her ear, and let the cameras capture everything. Eleanor had stood still, her lips parting slightly as the realization settled in. But she hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't cried or yelled. She had simply walked away. And he had let her. Victor's fingers curled into fists. He had been so sure of himself back then, so certain that Eleanor wasn't what he wanted. But seeing her today, seeing who she had become, he realized something awful. He hadn't left Eleanor because she wasn't enough. He had left her because he wasn't. She had been too strong, too independent, too everything he didn't know how to handle. And instead of stepping up, instead of being the man she deserved, he had run away. And now she was even further from his reach. The car pulled up to the Blackwood estate, a massive mansion resting atop a hill, secluded from the city's chaos. Victor stepped out, his movements stiff, his mind still tangled in thoughts of Eleanor. He walked into the dimly lit foyer, tossing his keys onto the marble counter, but the silence of the house felt suffocating. This was what he had chosen. An empty home, an empty life. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Victor frowned, striding toward it and pulling it open. Isabella. She stood there, her arms crossed, eyes filled with accusation. Victor's stomach twisted. Not now. What do you want? He asked, his voice sharper than intended. Isabella scoffed, stepping inside without permission. Oh, I don't know, Victor. Maybe to find out where the hell you've been for the last few days? He exhaled, running a hand down his face. I've been busy. Busy? Isabella let out a cold laugh. With what? Because it sure as hell wasn't with me. Victor said nothing. He was too drained to argue. Isabella studied him, her brows furrowing. You saw her, didn't you? Victor's jaw tightened. Isabella, oh my God, she whispered, realization dawning in her eyes. You did. Victor didn't deny it. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Isabella's lips curled into a bitter smirk. You thought she was still going to be waiting for you, didn't you? Victor turned away, pouring himself a drink at the bar. I don't owe you an explanation. Isabella scoffed. Of course you don't. You never did. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into something more venomous. Let me guess, Victor. You thought Eleanor was still pining over you while you were off with me, living your fantasy of the younger, more exciting woman. She laughed mockingly. Newsflash, she moved on without you. Victor slammed his glass onto the counter, the sound echoing through the room. I know that. Isabella smirked. Good. Then maybe now you'll stop looking for her. Victor clenched his teeth. He wanted to be angry at Isabella, but deep down he knew she wasn't the problem. He was. He had destroyed his own marriage. He had walked away from the best thing in his life, and now he was alone. For the first time, truly alone. Isabella picked up her purse, shaking her head. You know what, Victor? I actually feel bad for you. She gave him a pitying look. You had everything, and now you have nothing. She turned, walking toward the door. But before she left, she glanced back over her shoulder, her final words laced with cruelty. She doesn't love you anymore, Victor. She never will. Then she was gone. And Victor, he stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady himself against the weight of his own choices. Eleanor had moved on. She had built a life without him, and for the first time he realized she had won. Victor Blackwood had always prided himself on being a man in control. He built an empire from the ground up, navigated the ruthless world of business with precision, and always got what he wanted. Yet for the first time in his life, he had no control. The realization settled in like a weight on his chest. Eleanor was gone. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had erased him from her life. And worse, she was thriving. Victor had spent the last 3 years telling himself she would never recover from their separation, that she would always look back at him as the one that got away. But he had been the fool. Eleanor had built something bigger, something stronger, something without him. He knew he should move on, just like she had. But the truth was, he didn't know how. Sitting in his office at Blackwood Enterprises, Victor leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window. The sun had begun to set, casting golden hues across the glass buildings, but the sight did little to soothe the storm raging inside him. His desk was covered in files, all containing information on Eleanor, not out of malice, not out of some desperate attempt to destroy her, but because he had to understand. How had she built her empire so quickly? Who had supported her? What had she done in the years he had been absent? Victor opened a folder, scanning the contents. Eleanor had started from nothing after their divorce, just the settlement he had thrown at her like an afterthought. A lesser woman would have wasted it, would have drowned in grief and resentment, but not Eleanor. She had invested every cent, strategized her next moves with the kind of intelligence he had always admired in her. Within months, she had formed a company, one that now stood as one of his biggest competitors. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Had she been this brilliant all along? Had he been too blinded by his own arrogance to see it? A knock on the door made him glance up. His assistant, Jared, stepped inside, his expression hesitant. Sir, your presence has been requested at the board meeting in 15 minutes. Victor sighed, straightening his posture. Noted. Jared lingered for a moment. There's something else. Victor narrowed his eyes. Spit it out. Jared hesitated, then placed an open magazine on the desk. Victor's stomach twisted the moment he saw the headline. Eleanor Blackwood, from betrayed wife to billionaire mogul. And worse, it featured a photo of Eleanor standing beside a man. Not just any man, Nicholas Hayes. Victor felt something dark coil in his gut. Nicholas was one of the most powerful investors in the country, A man Victor had spent years trying to impress, only to be met with polite indifference. And now he was standing beside Eleanor, smiling like they shared a secret. Victor's grip on the magazine tightened. When was this published? This morning, Jared answered. It's been circulating everywhere. Victor clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. Eleanor's success was one thing, but Nicholas Hayes, that was another. Victor had never been the jealous type. He never had to be. He was always the man others envied, the one people aspired to be. But now he was the one watching from the sidelines. Jared shifted uncomfortably. There's more. Victor's patience snapped. What else? Jared pulled out another document, a printed invitation. Victor's eyes scanned the words quickly, his breath catching. Eleanor Blackwood and Nicholas Hayes cordially invite you to the Blackwood Hayes Charity Gala, an exclusive event to celebrate their newest philanthropic endeavor. Blackwood Hayes. Victor's stomach dropped. She was using her name with his. Not out of love, not out of some desperate attachment to him, but as a weapon. She was turning Blackwood into a legacy detached from him. Victor slammed the magazine shut, his jaw tightening. I want details on this gala. Date, location, guest list. Jared nodded. Understood. Victor leaned back in his chair, inhaling deeply. This was it. Eleanor had moved on, she had won, and he had been left behind, watching as the woman he had once discarded rose higher than he had ever imagined. And for the first time in his life, Victor Blackwood didn't know what to do next. Victor Blackwood had never attended an event where he wasn't the most important man in the room. He was used to dominating conversations, commanding attention, and setting the tone for the night. But tonight was different. Tonight he was the outsider. As he stepped into the grand ballroom of the Blackwood Hayes Charity Gala, the sight before him made his stomach twist. The event was breathtaking, lavish but tasteful, opulent, yet refined. Eleanor had always had a gift for balancing elegance with power. But this was something else entirely. The chandeliers above sparkled, casting golden light across the marble floors. The crowd was filled with the elite of the elite, business tycoons, celebrities, foreign dignitaries. Everyone who mattered in high society was here, and they weren't here for him. They were here for Eleanor Blackwood. She stood at the far end of the ballroom, a vision of power and grace. Eleanor had always been beautiful, but tonight she was radiant. Her deep emerald gown hugged her figure, the fabric shimmering with every movement. But it wasn't just her appearance that stunned him. It was her presence. She exuded confidence, her head held high, her expression poised, her voice soft but commanding as she spoke to those around her. And then there was Nicholas Hayes, standing at her side like he belonged there. Victor had always believed that no man could ever take his place, that Eleanor, no matter how much she resented him, would never truly be able to replace him. But looking at them now, it was clear he had been wrong. Victor's fingers curled into fists at his sides, though he forced himself to relax. He had no right to be angry. He had been the one to leave. He had been the one to humiliate her. He had been the one to toss her aside for another woman. So why did it feel like he was the one who had been betrayed? Victor Blackwood. A smooth, cool voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned and found himself face to face with Nicholas Hayes. Up close, the man was even more intimidating than he was in the photographs. Tall, powerful, with a quiet authority that made people listen when he spoke. Nicholas studied Victor with an unreadable expression, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't far from it. I'm surprised to see you here, Nicholas said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Or should I say, impressed. Victor narrowed his eyes. Impressed? Most men wouldn't have the guts to show up after everything you did to Eleanor. Victor's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. I'm here for business. Nicholas chuckled. Right, business. Victor wanted to say more, wanted to defend himself, to make it clear that he wasn't some bitter ex-husband crawling back in regret. But before he could respond, Eleanor appeared. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. For 3 years he had imagined this moment, what he would say, how he would act, the way she would react. None of it had prepared him for this. She didn't look angry, she didn't look hurt, she didn't even look surprised. She just looked indifferent, as if he no longer mattered, as if he was just another guest at her event. Victor, she greeted smoothly, her voice calm, controlled. I wasn't expecting you. Victor swallowed. I wanted to see the woman everyone's been talking about. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I hope you're enjoying the view. Victor exhaled sharply. Eleanor, can we talk? Nicholas, who had been watching silently, took that as his cue to step away. I'll leave you two to catch up. Victor barely acknowledged him. His focus was on her, on the woman he had left behind, the woman who no longer seemed to care. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Talk about what, Victor? His throat tightened. You know what? She sighed as if she was already bored of the conversation. Victor, I don't hold grudges. I don't waste time on the past. You did what you did, and I moved on. Her words should have relieved him. Instead, they made his chest tighten. You really don't care anymore, do you? He asked, his voice low. Eleanor gave him a slow, assessing look, and then she laughed. Not bitterly, not angrily, but genuinely, as if the idea of her still caring about him was amusing. Oh, Victor, she said, shaking her head. I stopped caring the moment I realized you weren't worth it. Her words hit harder than he expected. She took a sip of her champagne, watching him with the same distant amusement. You thought I'd be broken forever, didn't you? That I'd spend years crying over you? Wishing you'd come back? Victor's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. I have a secret for you, Victor. You were never the best thing that happened to me. Leaving you, that was. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Eleanor, but she wasn't done. She set her glass down, stepping even closer, her voice softer now, but sharper than ever. You left me in the most humiliating way possible, she said. You threw me aside like I was nothing, and for years I let your betrayal define me, but not anymore. She smiled, and this time it was real. I built something better, Victor, without you, despite you. His chest tightened. I can see that. She nodded, taking a step back. Good. Then you understand that you don't belong here. Victor inhaled deeply, but he knew she was right. This wasn't his world anymore. It was hers, and he had no place in it. For the first time in his life, Victor Blackwood knew what true regret felt like. But it was too late. Eleanor had already won. Victor Blackwood had always believed that power was his to command. Money had given him control over everything. Business, relationships, and even people's perceptions of him. But now, standing at the edge of a ballroom where he no longer belonged, watching a woman he had once dismissed rise far beyond him, he felt something unfamiliar. Regret. True, suffocating regret. He had expected Eleanor to crumble after he left her, expected her to mourn the loss of him like some tragic heroine in a play. He had expected her to struggle, to live in his shadow, to remain tethered to his name. But instead, she had erased him. She had built an empire of her own. She had transformed into someone so unreachable that now, even standing feet away from her, she felt like a distant star, one he could never touch again. Victor turned away from the ballroom, weaving through the elegantly dressed guests, his heart pounding. He needed air, needed space. He strode toward the balcony, stepping out into the crisp night, gripping the marble railing as he stared down at the city below. For years, this city had been his playground. Now it belonged to her, and it burned. Quite the scene back there. Victor stiffened at the voice behind him. Nicholas Hayes. The man had an irritating way of always appearing at the worst moments. Victor exhaled sharply, forcing himself to keep his composure. Here to gloat? Nicholas chuckled, stepping beside him, resting his own hands on the balcony railing. Not really. I don't need to. Eleanor already did that quite well, don't you think? Victor's jaw clenched. I didn't come here to be mocked. Nicholas glanced at him, smirking. Then you shouldn't have shown up at an event where everyone here knows exactly how much you screwed up. Victor bit back the sharp words on his tongue. He hated feeling like this. Weak, exposed. He wasn't used to being on the losing side. But this was a loss he could never recover from. Nicholas took a sip from his whiskey glass. I have to admit, though, I wasn't sure if you'd actually come. Victor exhaled harshly. I almost didn't. And yet you did. Victor didn't respond, because they both knew why. Eleanor, he had told himself this was about business, about securing deals and maintaining his influence. But that was a lie. He had come here for her. Some part of him had believed that if he saw her again, if they talked, if he reminded her of who they had once been, maybe, just maybe, he could undo the past. But there was no past to return to. Eleanor had moved on, and now he was the one left behind. Nicholas sighed, setting his glass down on the railing. You know, Victor, I actually feel a little sorry for you. Victor scoffed. Spare me the sympathy. I mean it. Nicholas shrugged. You lost the one person who could have made you a better man. Victor flinched, because it was true, and hearing it from Nicholas only made it worse. Nicholas pushed away from the railing, adjusting his cufflinks. Eleanor deserves better, and you know it. Victor didn't argue, because he knew. Nicholas took a step toward the doors, pausing for a moment. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Victor, if you can. And with that, he left. Victor remained on the balcony, staring down at the city lights. He had everything once, a wife who had loved him, a home filled with warmth, a life that should have been enough. But he had thrown it all away, and now he was the one standing in the cold, alone. Eleanor, meanwhile, was enjoying every moment of the night. The event was a massive success. Donations had poured in, business deals had been secured, and most importantly, she had proven to herself once and for all that Victor Blackwood no longer had any power over her. For years his name had been a weight on her chest. Now he was just a man who had lost her. As she sipped her champagne, her gaze drifted toward the balcony doors, where she had last seen Victor disappear. A small part of her, a very small part, wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was he regretting his choices? Did he wish he had treated her differently? Would things have been different if he had? But the thought was fleeting, because the past no longer mattered. She had a new life now, a better one, a future built on her terms, and nothing, not even Victor Blackwood, could take that away from her. As Nicholas approached her with a drink, offering a knowing smirk, Eleanor smiled. Yes, she was finally free. Victor Blackwood had always believed himself to be untouchable. Untouchable in business, in influence, in power, and in love. But tonight had proven him so very wrong. As he stood outside the grand ballroom, staring at the city that had once belonged to him, he felt the weight of his own mistakes crushing him. Eleanor was gone. Not just physically, not just emotionally. She had erased him from her life, and the worst part? She had flourished without him. It wasn't just that she had moved on. It was that she had become someone even greater than he could have imagined. The wife he had humiliated, abandoned, and discarded had risen beyond him. Victor had come tonight thinking foolishly that he could somehow fix things, that he could talk to Eleanor, charm her, convince her to at least acknowledge him again. Maybe even, but no, there was nothing left to fix. Victor wasn't used to feeling powerless. But as he looked through the glass doors into the ballroom, watching Eleanor laugh, watching her shine, watching her exist in a world where he no longer mattered, he finally understood. He had lost her, for good, and nothing would ever change that. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt nothing but peace. For the first time in years, she was light. There was no shadow of Victor lingering over her, no pain pulling at her chest, no anger, no bitterness, just relief. She had made it, she had survived him, and she had won. As she finished another conversation with an investor, she felt Nicholas appear at her side, holding out a fresh glass of champagne. Thought you could use a refill. She smirked, taking it. Are you trying to get me drunk, Nicholas? Nicholas chuckled. Wouldn't dream of it. They stood together for a moment, watching the ballroom, watching the people who had come to celebrate her success. Nicholas tilted his head toward the glass doors. He's still out there, you know. Eleanor didn't need to ask who. She took a slow sip of her champagne, glancing toward the balcony where she knew Victor was standing. She could feel the weight of his stare, even from a distance, and for the first time it didn't bother her at all. He made his choices, Eleanor said simply. Now he gets to live with them. Nicholas nodded approvingly. He deserves worse, if you ask me. Eleanor let out a small laugh. Oh, trust me, this is worse. Because Victor Blackwood was the kind of man who thrived on control. And losing her was the one thing he would never be able to control. She turned away from the glass doors, turning her back on Victor once and for all. Nicholas offered his arm. Shall we? Eleanor smiled, linking her arm with his. Yes, she said, let's enjoy the night. And with that, she walked forward, without ever looking back. Victor remained outside long after the event began to wind down, long after Eleanor had left, long after the lights had started to dim and the noise had started to fade. He had lost track of time, but time no longer mattered, because he had already lost everything. And as the night stretched into dawn, As the city slowly came to life again, Victor Blackwood finally admitted to himself the truth he had been avoiding for years. He had been wrong about everything, and now it was far too late to make it right. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see that strength, success, and karma always find their way back. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more powerful stories. Powerful stories. Powerful stories.